Hi everyone, welcome to an interview by Lawctopus. Today we have with us Sushruti Tripathi. Sushruti wears many hats, that of a lawyer, academic, writer, poet, mediator. She also happens to be my senior from college. But today she's here to talk about her new book, Naan Bread and Chai Latte. Sushruti is a graduate from NUJS and has worked as a graduate solicitor with HSF London. Currently, she's pursuing her LLM at Jindal Global Law School. Welcome, Sushruti. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Umang. It's really nice to be here and to see you after a very long time.
Likewise. So before we start, Sushruti, I'd like to ask you this. Suppose if I'd never known about you, and I happen to meet you somewhere, and then I ask who is Sushruti Tripathi. So how would you introduce yourself? How do you talk about yourself in your own words?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, introducing oneself is always difficult. But if I had to pick an adjective, like the first one I would go for is creative. I'm a creative person. And that could be through dance or writing or performance poetry. I also like to get creativity into my law. So I'm a creative person and I do law because I'm passionate about it. So I'm doing climate change and energy law because it's an area and issue I care about. And whenever I find the time, I write poetry and I try and indulge myself in all sorts of random creative pursuits.
Wow, so yeah, so creativity is something which I think comes across as primary when somebody sees the kind of work you've done. But talking about your latest creative pursuit, why don't you give us a glimpse of the book which has come out?
Yeah, sure. So the book is called Naan, Bread and Chai Latte, and it is basically a collection of a little over 50 poems and a couple of prose pieces as well. I've tried a very new format with this book because generally, when you pick up a poetry book, it's just a bunch of poems together, and they generally have a common theme running through them. But whenever I read them, I always wanted to know what was going on in the author's mind and what was the background story behind the poems. And so I tried to do that with the book in the sense that I tried to create a narrative and story. And that builds upon the 2 years that I was working with Herbert Smith Freehills in London. So the book is about trying to find home and what it means to different people, trying to find your identity. It's also about chasing dreams and then trying to figure out whether they taste as good as they look. And so the book is a mix of emotions and poems connected to different themes. And it's divided in 3 chapters. The first one is about the journey. So trying to understand whether the career part of my journey has turned out the way I wanted it to and what I like, what any NRI, in fact, faces when they move to a different country and try and build a life for themselves. The second part is about love and losing love and then trying to find yourself again. So it's called Hirayat and Heart. Uh, the Hirayat is a Welsh word, which means missing a home that never was.
Oh,
And so, yeah, so that word always kind of stuck with me since I heard about it. And so that's why the second chapter is called Hirayat and Heart. And the third chapter is We Need Quixote. Quixote is my favorite classic novel character from Spain, Don Quixote. And the idea is that it's about what we want to leave the world with and what wishes and ambitions sort of we have for the world. So it's poetry about politics, about elections, about abortion rights and women's rights and feminism and dealing with depression and anxiety. So a lot of different issues around the world that were happening while I was also trying to live my life and find myself in as an NRI and a person deciding whether I want to come back to India or not.
wow. So let me get this. It's a book of which contains poetry and prose, and also poetry running around many different themes such as work, working in a different country, away from home, and how various issues that have come around during the time of you writing it. So when you're working on such a project which covers such a vast expanse area, so I want to understand how does this idea come about that you want to write about these topics, And then how did this like idea materialize into you publishing something where like you take a thread and tie all of all of these things together into a book? So how does that process take place where you decide, okay, this is where I want a poem to be, this is where I want the prose to be, this is how I want the poems to be, like these topics which they have to deal with. So generally, can you walk us through like your mindset, like before think like writing the book and like while writing the book, like what were you trying to like do with it in terms of like connect to the audience in what ways?
Mhm. Actually, so the process for me was spread over a very long duration of time, because a lot of the poetry was written when I was in London, as in when the situations were unfolding. So the themes of love or loss or identity and home, they kept coming up in my life. And as and when they came up, I wrote about them. So once I finally decided to come back to India, when I was unpacking, I came across all these scraps of pieces, paper that had scribbles on them. And some of the poems I had actually managed to write in the journal that I had kept for writing things, but barely managed to write anything in it. And there were some that were on random WhatsApp chats that I had sent to friends, some in, like office conference pads. So I found like all of my poetry in different parts of my luggage and pieced them all together. And then as I was going through it, I realized it it's very reflective of anybody's journey who has, faced these questions and been in these circumstances. So the idea in my head to first write a story about it was just the first chapter of the book, which is called Naan, Bread and Chai Latte. And the story was about how you chase your dreams, then you meet the dreams, and you try and figure out whether it was everything it was touted to be and everything everyone said it should be, and whether you're okay disagreeing with what people think you should be happy about or, excited about. So that was the idea behind the book. And so I wrote a couple of prose pieces where I thought the poetry needed context. Otherwise, as you go from one poem to another, you can sense how the mindset is changing. So it already had a flow, and I just put in prose pieces where I thought they were necessary. And so that was the idea. And then my mom, who is the primary reason this book has been published, because she's the one that nagged me to no end, saying, "Oh, you always keep writing, but you never publish anything. What is the point of you writing?" And mind you, this is a person who does not like poetry. She does not appreciate it. She doesn't read poetry. She has no interest in listening to my performances. She still hasn't bought a copy of my book. She said, "अरे घर में तो तुम्हारे पास है ही, why मतलब मैं क्या ही करूँ?" So she kept nagging me, saying, "You have written so much, and from what I hear from people who like poetry, you seem to not be too awful at it. So you should publish it." So yeah, and so then when I showed her the first chapter of the book, that was all I had written as a book. She said, "Well, this is only like what, some 30, 35 odd pages. If you're publishing a book, you might as well put in more poems. I'm sure you've written them." And so then
Hmm.
that's how the second chapter and the third chapter were born, because I thought, well, I want to explore the whole experience of living in a different country and figuring things out as you go. So that was sort of the process. And then the prose pieces came in to provide context and narrative wherever I thought going from one poem to the other needed a little bit more in between. So that was kind of the process. I paid a lot of attention to how the lines were laid out or what photos went in. So most of the photos in the book are also photos I've clicked. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, so some of the poems are were actually inspired by the photos I had taken. So it was more a sort of journey of piecing all of those things together so that it ended up looking like a narrative.
Wow. And so how did the process of publishing start? Like once you were like at what stage did you approach a publisher? Because like if I understand like this book you self-published along with like this publisher which is called as Notion Press. So can you tell us like how like when did that process begin exactly? Like, did you have the book completed when you approached the publisher? Or were you still like, was the book still in the works when you approached the publisher? And then after that, what is the process which happens? Because like I know very less about like publishing a book. So can you walk me through like how publishing happens? Because I think this is something which like all our viewers would also be very interested in.
Yeah, sure. Actually, it's a funny story again featuring the mother. So my mom's office colleague, um, her dad is an author and he has self-published. And so my mom was telling her, oh, basically not. My mother was lamenting my lack of will to publish my works. And so my mom and her colleagues sat in their staff room. So my mom's a teacher. So they sat in their staff room and they decided they are going to sign me up with this publisher. So they opened Notion Press website because her colleagues dad self-published using the same publishers. And then, well, they opened the website, they put in my details, and they sent the form, submitted it, gave the agency my phone number, my email address. And my mom comes home and says, oh, you know what? By the way, today evening, you might get a call from this publishing agency about your book, which at that point of time was not even complete. It was just an idea. And so, yeah, and sure enough, in the evening, they called me and they said, well, you registered to self publish with us, and these are the services that we provide, these are the different packages. Uh, but before we get into that, we would need you to send us sort of a rough manuscript at least, because we want to know whether it's the kind of book we'd like to publish and have on our catalog. Um, so yeah, and I said, well, the book isn't ready, but I have a couple of poems. And so they said, yeah, sure, send those across. And so I sent them what I thought were some of my best poems. And eventually they said, well, yes, this looks like something we would want to publish, and welcome on board. Let us know what all services you'd require. And, so any self-publishing is basically, you can decide how much of the publishing process you want to undertake on your own. Some people self-publish without the help of publishing agencies, and they do everything from layout to graphic designing to marketing on their own. So there's different levels of the kind of assistance you can get from a self-publishing agency. So based on what I thought I was comfortable with and how much time I had, I decided, okay, XYZ is what I want help with, which is mostly like the layout and putting the book in the ebook format and getting an ISBN number, getting it copyrighted, and all of that, plus distribution on e-platforms and ebook platforms and physical sales and fulfillment of physical sales. So that sort of department. So those are the things I sought their help on. And yes, it was a very nice experience. Took me about an year to finally have the book on Amazon and Flipkart and Kindle and everywhere else. But it was nice to sort of have those deadlines where your publishing agent calls you up and says, where is the updated manuscript that you had promised us last month? So I think most lawyers will relate to this. The deadlines kept me going. It was a nice process.
Yeah. I think even if you didn't have an agent, I think your mom, from what you described, would be a good enough like reminder to write. And I think that's great because like I also try some writing, and I think the biggest barrier to writing is just procrastination. So I think you need somebody to tell you that write.
Yeah. No, I am very thankful. Yes.
Yeah. So when you talk about like it took 1 year, so it took 1 year from the moment you approached the publisher to the book coming out to Amazon, right? If I understand correctly.
Yes, a little bit of that time, frankly, like 1 year is sort of, I think, on the higher side. I wouldn't have taken 1 year if I hadn't been doing other things in between. So for a couple of months, I put the book on hold in between because I had to give a couple of exams and do a couple of other things. I was also doing the Feminist Poetry Festival. And so things like that kept taking up time. So there would be 15 days that nothing was getting done, or 2 months where nothing was getting done. But otherwise, if you're a little more consistent, I don't think it should take that much time. And I went through at least 6 rounds of edits of the book Also because once you decide what size format you want, if it's poetry, then your line spacing changes. And with poetry, it really matters how much you want in one line and where you want the line breaks. So then you have to sort of re-edit the poem for it to convey the same things that you wanted to earlier, because the proportions are now different. So all of those little things you don't realize until you are actually in the process. Things like margin will take up more space, so you'll have lesser space of text, and what type of paper you want, and how like choosing one paper over the other significantly affects your selling price, and what sort of contracts Amazon offers. All of those things you discover once you decide to go through the publishing process. Because it was quite an eye opener, I think. Like in a good way. Like I learned a lot, I think.
Yeah, I'm sure, because like now I realize when I have to post something online, I have to choose the font on, say, like a blog which I have. I realize that's only so difficult, but like choosing an entire like formatting a book in itself must have been like a really, really big task. So now that you've gone through the process, would you have like any tips or something for people who are wanting to, say, like go down this path of like publishing a book by themselves? So like a couple of things which now in retrospect you wish you should have known, or like if you would have known had been better. So like if you can share with us a couple of things which like you've learned along the way.
So, well, in terms of self-publishing, I think the first thing that people should realize is who their audience are, because that affects pricing of the book. And I'll explain that better. Um, if they want the book to really sell, so if they're looking at quantity sales, then they would ideally like the book to be reasonably priced, or priced in the lower range so that it's more accessible, especially for first-time authors. And if you want to do that, then things that you never thought of will affect the production cost. For example, whether you go for a 70 GSM thickness paper or a 100 GSM thickness paper, whether you go for matte finish or a glossy finish, whether it's art paper or your normal paper, that really changes the cost of production of the book. And this is something that I wasn't aware of at the beginning. So once the entire process was done and we were finally settling on what MRP to put on the book, my publisher came up with a figure that was unacceptable to me, because I said the book wouldn't be accessible to some people that I think might be interested in reading the book. And my publishers told me that there is the price that I was looking at wouldn't even cover the printing cost of the book, because I had colored photographs, which meant that they had to be printed on art paper, which meant that the cost of publishing the book is twice as much as regular paper. And that was an eye opener and not something I had expected, which is why then I said, well, Kindle prices should be as low as possible. And that's kind of how I try to negotiate the accessibility to the book aspect. But equally, I feel like that's something you want to discuss with your publisher or think about right at the outset, whether you want a color book or not, whether if you want a color book, are you okay with the price range it might end up being in? The second thing that I think is worth thinking about is your marketplaces, because if you're going to sell on Amazon or Flipkart, the contracts you have with these places often will say that 50% of your MRP will be charged by the e-commerce company as a transaction charge.
Wow.
So you can't say that, oh, I won't take too much royalty, let's just sell a little bit above the cost price. Because then you have to pay 50% of your MRP to Amazon or Flipkart. So you will end up paying them for every book you sell from your own pocket. So it's unsustainable. So your MRP also shoots up, because you have to make sure even after giving 50% of the MRP as transaction cost to Amazon, you have enough left to cover publication and then maybe some royalty if it still works out. And your self-publishing agency, because of competition, can't sell for lower than the price that you agree to sell on Amazon or Flipkart for. So those sort of things really decide the journey after publication, but are worth thinking about right at the outset. So those are conversations people should have with their agents at the beginning. I think those are very important. Everything else, I think, in the process gets managed quite well, like from layout
Hmm.
to other things. It's easier to manage. And even if like your marketing expectations are different and something else get delivered, there are things that you can do around it. But quality and color and pricing are things that you would want to get right at the beginning.
But that's a surprise. 50% of the transaction cost goes to like Amazon or Flipkart for their like of the price of the book goes to them for their transaction cost.
Yes.
Wow. Like in all the books, physical books, ebooks.
Not ebooks. So ebooks is different. Physical books, they take 50% of the MRPS transaction cost. Even your publisher will take a cut of the MRPS transaction cost, but their cut is mostly like 20% around
Hmm.
average. Um, with ebooks, it really depends because there is, once you host it, there is no real recurring cost for every new purchase. So they charge you like a basic amount plus taxes and GST and all of the other things. So which is why there can be a huge difference between pricing of the physical copy and your ebook. For example, my ebook is 150 rupees and on discount in February. So Amazon's now put it for 49 rupees, which is, I mean, I'm very glad because, more accessibility to more
Hmm.
number of people. Whereas the physical copy of the book is 760 rupees, which I can run a discount on it on my publisher's website, but not on Amazon, simply because of the 50%.
Hmm.
And I don't even get 10% of it as royalty. Like it's my royalty is single digits. So it like you have to make sure you know depending on what services you take from your self-publishing agent, you will end up paying for it. And so you want to know whether you have uh, if you want to spend the money on it and whether you will be able to recover it through sales or not. So those
Hmm.
are also the things you want to take into account.
Okay. And also just to understand, so in self-published books also you get like a royalty on every book which is sold.
Yes.
Like a okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
you
I
pay,
think
sorry, you were
no,
saying?
please continue. No, no, I had a comment for this, so please like continue.
No, I'm saying so you pay them lump sum for their services in the beginning.
Okay,
So
okay.
whatever they help you with.
Hmm.
And then later on everything is royalty based. So my like Notion Press does not take any part from your royalty because they
Okay.
charge you at once for all the services they are providing right at the
Hmm.
beginning. So then any royalty you earn goes directly into your account.
Okay.
Um, yeah, but like it depends from agency to agency how the royalties are calculated and what they entail. So, and whether your book is being bulk printed or printed as per order, that will
Hmm.
decide how much percentage of royalty from the sale price you get. So, there's lots of factors in consideration. It's a very different world you come to realize once you're in it.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure because in fact the other day we like we had a conversation with Rohit Day who's written his book called A People's Constitution, and that
Mhm.
book was the hardcover is priced around 400 rupees, the Kindle version is priced around 1200, and the paperback is around 2800. So then I'd asked him that how does this work, because like hardcover is supposed to be the most expensive, but it's the
Yeah.
cheapest in your case. So he was then explaining because there are two different publishers, one international publisher, one Indian publisher. So therefore, like there's some inter-se arrangement. And like again, like he said, it's a different world only. It's a long story. So I think like all books go through this process.
Yeah, yeah. International sales don't even like. I have
Hmm.
decided to not even check how the royalties are calculated because it's some really complicated process. But eventually, I will have to sit with those statements and see what actually happens.
Yeah, for sure. Uh, So, coming to your book next, like I saw the book had a heavy, like a large part of it was also driven by, like your vacation scheme or like your training contract abroad, and then after that, like how the work panned out in the first few months, where you said it was actually like being in suits, and then after that, like after a while, you realized that probably like this was good, but you would want to like try something else probably. Um, so, can you tell us about that experience also? Like, how was like that going working there, and like what did you go through to take like this step of writing and like then deciding to come back and do your LLM first?
Hmm. Okay, so I mean, I had decided very early on that I didn't want to sit for day zero in law school because I interned with a couple of corporate law firms. I realized that's not really what makes me want to get up on Monday mornings. So I have nothing against corporate law firms. I think they're doing a good job,
Hmm.
but it's just not for me. But then HSF came along for their graduate recruitment day talk, and then I spoke to a couple of seniors who were at HSF and they were working there. And what I gathered from that was that the work-life balance is much better, and the quality of work is also really good, and the lifestyle is something that I really wanted to experience. So that's why I decided to sit for, I decided to apply for Herbert Smith Freehills, and thankfully they liked me as much as I liked them, and so they offered me a training contract, which was really nice. And so I went there very excited, very happy, very willing to try new things and see if this is what is for me and this is what I want to do as a career for the rest of my life. And then in the first 6 months, I had an amazing team. My supervisor, Haley, she's just an absolute gem of a person. And yeah, and my first team made me feel really comfortable. The secretary in the team, she baked me a cake as a welcome to London present. So she was also really sweet. So just everybody made me feel very at home, and the work was great. Of course, I really enjoyed working in the media law and telecoms and technology team. And you feel, because winters were still kind of around, because I went in February, uh, you feel like you're living the life that everybody tells corporate lawyers live, because
Hmm.
you're wearing your trench coat and you have this fancy bag and you have like a Starbucks coffee, and it sounds really silly, but when you're, I don't know,
Yeah,
23
yeah.
something, and all by yourself in a different country and living the life, you feel pretty amazing to begin with. And then
Hmm.
eventually it becomes a force of habit,
Hmm.
very habitual. Like now every barista, the way to work too well for it to be exciting anymore, and you settle into habits. And that's when you start noticing things that are more important than whether your life resembles suits or not. And so after the first 6 months, when the novelty of it all subsided a little bit, I was still enjoying my time in London. I loved living in the city,
Hmm.
but I think I also started to think if this was long term for me as a career, if I enjoyed corporate law enough. So
Hmm.
I really liked media and information law. I was around when GDPR was being implemented. So that was nice. But then I think over the next 1.5 years, I realized that I'm good at it, I like it, but it something was missing. And I've always been a very
Hmm.
socially motivated person. Like even when I was at NUJS, I used to volunteer with Make a Difference. And
Hmm.
even the 8-9 months I had between graduation and joining HSF, I was working with Slam Out Loud, and I was taking a class in association with Teach for India, and I was teaching the kids creative expression. And so that sort of part of my life felt it was conspicuously absent. And so I tried to take up a lot of pro bono. HSF is very big about about pro bono, so that
Hmm.
was helpful, but it still didn't feel enough. So eventually, I thought about it a lot and decided I wanted to uh, not continue to be a corporate lawyer. It was an experience that I still value. Like I would still do
Hmm.
everything the same way. If I were asked, I would do it all over again. But I
Hmm.
think I got out at the optimum time. Like 2 years was enough time for me to have experienced the lifestyle, to have understood how a foreign law firm works, to have gotten trained in a different jurisdiction, made some good friends. So traveled quite a bit in Europe. So
Hmm.
all of that was a very wholesome experience for 2 years in that sense, but also had hit its optimum limit. And I wanted to now move into a career that I thought was more long term for me, which is why then I decided to do a master's in areas that interest me and
Hmm.
also have a policy and social objective angle. So
Hmm.
initially, I was considering data privacy, information law, and communications governance, because those were my primary areas of interest. But then I accepted my offer from NYU, and then COVID happened, and then my
Hmm.
parents said, "We're never going to send you to New York." So And of course, there are very limited scholarships for
Hmm.
LLM candidates, and I didn't want to take a student loan because that would have meant working abroad again. So then I decided to do an LLM in India, and I researched quite a bit as to what is the socially motivated LLM that I could do in India, and I chanced upon this LLM that I'm doing right now.
Hmm.
So that's a specialization in energy law, climate change, and environment law, and it's offered by WWF and Jindal Global Law School together. So I'm quite enjoying it actually, finishing this summer. So quite excited about it.
Oh, that's great that you've like found a course to your liking. So this brings me to the questions I wanted to ask as a person like who's involved like who also has a like a creative side to them in like the work you're doing. For example, you write poetry, prose, you also like perform a lot. And as a person who's practiced law, also what like if you had to pick what would be like more central in your life? Is it law or is it like something like writing? Or is it something which you can't choose? I'll give you that option also so that I can let you off easy.
No, thanks for the last option. It's like picking between two children. It's very difficult task. I don't think I could do it. But I think it would depend on the situation. Like if I were
Okay.
you, the first question you asked me, right? Like how would I introduce myself? I think
Hmm.
I would introduce myself based on my audience. So if I was on the stage about to perform or dance or
Hmm.
read out poetry, I would start with like, I'm a poet. I like writing. I like creating. But I moonlight as a lawyer and worry about the environment and climate change in my spare time.
Hmm.
But if I was, you know, doing my policy work or being a lawyer, then I would say, oh, I uh, practice climate change law and policy and energy law and policy. And in my spare time, you can always find me performing and reading and writing. So I think it's very audience specific.
Uh, so then how do you find the confluence of both of these? Because like I also saw you've done some work in say like poetry for conflict resolution. So so firstly like I'd want to understand that also, but like before that I want to ask like how do you see the role of like arts playing in your life as a person who also does law? Because law is generally something which is considered like drab, too textual, something which doesn't have like too much um like it has a different kind of creativity but not the same creativity as say you would have like in performance arts or say when you're writing directing something. So as a person who has interests and like very strong interests in both, how do you see like that affecting like your practice for law or like the way you interpret like the poetry you're doing? So can you talk a little about that? Then we'll move on to the like s- center for conflict resolution.
Center for Poetry and Conflict
Poetry and
Resolution.
conflict resolution. Yeah, I was that. It just slipped my
No,
mind
it's fine.
completely.
It is a very unusual name, so I don't blame you for you know mixing the order of the words. It's so we'll come back to that later. So to
Hmm.
answer your previous question first, basically, I think this is going to sound slightly cliche, but the future of the world is interdisciplinary. Like I
Hmm.
truly believe it, and I've grown up believing that. I've always sort of tried to mix the different things that I was interested in together and see what comes out. So even within the arts, I know I have choreographed poetry. I have written poetry for pre-wedding shoots. So I keep trying to mix different art forms together to see what ends up happening. And the result always has been nice, thankfully. So it's given me more confidence to sort of keep experimenting that way. And then when I was working with Slam Out Loud, I was teaching a class of like 30 girls aged between 10 and 14. And I was also working with some of the children there for the Bowl project, which was a bunch of girls and boys who we were training for different
Hmm.
performance poetry and creative expression. And I remember I was doing an exercise with them. This was about, uh, because it's also poetry to self express. The idea is that we're not trying to teach the children or
Hmm.
get them to write better poetry. We're helping them find their voice through mediums of creative expression, predominantly poetry and performance poetry. So the idea was to get them to express as much as they can and understand how metaphors form sort of the basis of poems. So we did an exercise where we were trying to express emotions through colors. And so the format was I feel and then dash, and then the students had to fill in the color based on the current emotion they were feeling.
Hmm.
And then they had to say because, and then they had to fill in the reason, and then similarly, it went on and on. And one of the students, he said I feel red, and he wrote it with such vehemence that I had to stop and be like, acha matlab, what is behind this red emotion that you're feeling? And he said, I am very angry. And I said, okay, why are you angry? And he had basically had a fight with his dad, and he was very mad at his father, and he just refused to talk in too much detail about it. So what we did is we expanded the format of the poem in a way that helped him work through his emotions. And at the end of the poem, he realized he wasn't angry, but more upset about something his father had said. And he realized that that is something he could actually have a conversation with his dad about. And when I saw that happen is when I realized art is very important, not just for artists to express, but also for people who don't create for a living or who are not artists to be able to make sense of their emotions and their surroundings better. And that has stayed with me. And I've realized that in a lot of ways, a lot of sort of areas in law are about figuring things out in terms of the relationship between people. And if people knew better how they felt and were able to communicate it more effectively, chances are those disputes would be resolved faster. This is especially sort of the case in, say, family disputes or peer-to-peer dispute resolution through mediation in schools or other such settings, where you can use these creative art formats to get people to understand their feelings better and figure out what they want from a situation and a relationship better, because it's a very reflective process. And a little bit of the idea for this also comes from so I trained in poetry therapy while I was in London. And I don't know if you've heard about poetry therapy before. So
I have heard like a little bit about it. Like, please, like tell me more about it. I'd love to like hear your experience and like what it is.
Okay, so there is the Mary Ward Center in London, which does a lot of courses for people during weekends. And one of their advertisements was for an introductory course to poetry therapy, which immediately caught my attention. And I like doing different things. So I used to keep checking their catalogs for upcoming courses. It's just one of those things I did. And so this course really stood out. And I went for it. And it was, I think, a month-long course. And our instructor is a certified poetry therapist in London. She has hours and hours of experience in poetry therapy. And what they do is basically the same thing that we were talking about. They use poetry to help people deal with their emotions and conflicts better. So once you are in a poetry therapy group, and generally the sessions are group sessions, sharing becomes easier because oftentimes we can't say things directly, but it is easier to use metaphors and poetry to say them and also to confront them. So there are various techniques that you would use as a poetry therapy, which will all have to do something with, creating or creatively expressing. But it is therapeutic in the sense that it helps you work through your emotions and problems and situations. So all of these ideas were running around in my head and since before I left for London. So in the time that I had before I was joining HSF, I founded the Center for Poetry and Conflict Resolution. And this was this happened on a conversation with Rahim Shamji, who is the CEO of ADR ODR International, with which the center is affiliated now. So Rahim was my mediation trainer. So he trained me as a mediator, and then I got certified. So I had known him from quite a while ago. And then we invited Rahim. So me and two of my friends, we co-founded the ADR Society of NUJS in our fifth year. And we introduced mediation training to the university. And we approached Rahim for conducting the training at college. And then one of my other very dear mediator trainers, Tom Valenti, he came and took the training for people at NUJS. So basically, in that circle, I was talking about the idea of bringing arts and conflict resolution together, because conflict resolution is also about helping people work through relationship issues, essentially, especially if you're talking about family dispute or peer-to-peer disputes in schools and that setting. And so Rahim said, well, ADR, ODR International would love to have this center if you were interested in opening it. And so that's how the idea sort of was born. And then I participated in the launch. The center was launched in London in, I think, 2016. And I participated virtually, and I performed a poem there, which is part of the book as well. And yeah, so that's how the Center for Poetry and Conflict Resolution was born. We look at a lot of historical poetry, protest poetry, conflict poetry, and reconciliation poetry through a newsletter that we used to take out regularly. Currently, the center is undergoing what we call renovations. We're trying to figure out how to change its scope, and because now everything's online, and we're trying to see what the future holds for the center. But yes, that's the idea behind it.
Oh, that sounds very interesting, and like it's also something which sounds like very intuitively, which I think people would connect to, because like things like poetry, arts is something which is so, like, people hold it very closely to themselves. So yeah, best of luck for that. We'll be looking forward to like how it's there after it's undergone like reconstruction. So yeah, so because like you like poetry so much, Shushruti, can you please like give us some book recommendations, or like who are your favorite poets or authors, and also give us some suggestions for people who are just like starting out reading poetry, because usually like poetry is also one of those things which people consider like in some ways like inaccessible, because they just don't know where to start. It all sounds like very difficult for one to break into. So mm, who are your like favorite poets, and like some recommendations for somebody who's just starting to read poetry?
Okay. So, in terms of my favorite poets, they cover like a wide variety of genres and language. Uh, I like Tagore, and my Bengali is a little rusty. So, I'm currently reading this two volumes, which is Tagore translated by Gulzar. So, I have the Bangla version, and then I have Gulzar's Hindi translation and Gulzar's English translation. So it's helping me brush up on my Bengali and also simultaneously enjoy both Gulzar and Tagore. So it's one of those books that I really like. Then in terms of poets, I like the new sort of female poets in India quite a bit. So I really like Arundhati Subramaniam and Sumana Roy. Her recent book, I think Out of Syllabus, is hands down amazing. Then Tishani Doshi also writes good poetry. So those are sort of contemporary female Indian poets that I read. But otherwise, I also like Vikram Seth. I remember in one of our English classes in school, we had The Frog and the Nightingale. And and that poem has stayed with me since I read it first. And the way that he is able to write in verse with rhyming words, it just blows my mind, because most of us nowadays write in free verse, and so the rhyme scheme is missing from a lot of our works. So just how he's able to weave magic and metaphor into a rhyme scheme in a long poem is just something I really admire. One of my favorite poets of all times has been Sylvia Plath. Absolutely love her poetry and love how sometimes it is really, in fact, often it is confessional and very real and hard hitting. P.B. Shelley is another poet I really like. His Ode to the West Wind was what got me hooked onto him, and then I read like different genres of his poetry. So yeah, quite a few actually. When I start recounting, I'm like, oh, I like this poem by that poet, and then that poem by somebody else. But yeah, these are generally kind of the poets that I read. If someone's recently starting out, I know some people have this worry that poetry is this elitist thing that only, I don't know, people who went to certain schools or studied certain types of books can have access to and can understand. But I think that is not like at least to me personally, that is not the mark of a good poem. Like a
Hmm.
good poem has to be accessible. So it can be layered, which means that some people might understand what it is literally trying to say.
Hmm.
And there might be some people that understand the more deeper meanings and layers to the poem. But all in all, a poem should be accessible and shouldn't alienate its reader, is what I feel. So for anybody that's beginning to read poetry, they really shouldn't worry about whether they're reading authors or poets that are not considered very good. They should just read poetry that speaks to them and try and find meaning in poetry that is not just literal. Like if they start reading poems and they find poems that mean things more than what they literally say, then that's a good poem to read and start with. Again, also not force themselves to read in a language that they're not comfortable in. Like there are so many good Urdu poets, Hindi poets, English poets. People should start with who they're comfortable with. Some people love shairis, but just dislike free verse.
Hmm.
So if that's the kind of person you are, you read more shairi. Rekta has this. It's a very nice website. It gives you word by word translation of all the Urdu and Hindi words in the ghazal as you read it. So websites like those can also be very helpful. So I think, yeah, people should start with what they're comfortable with instead of trying to chase some, oh, she said Sylvia Plath is a great poet, so let me start with Sylvia Plath. That generally is not the best way to go about it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, those are some great recommendations. In fact, like I before this interview, I was just reading this book by Vikram Sivya. I have it right here on my The Golden Gate. This is also very nice. So, like when you were talking about like how he like connects verses in such a way which is like very difficult to do, but still it's very coherent. So yeah, just like blown away when I saw that the entire novel has been written in verse, which was just like very fresh. But yeah, coming to fresh, this also reminds me of like for example, in your book also you've tried lots of different things. For example, like it's a combination of poetry and prose. There are also sections where like it's written in Hindi and followed by the same poem in English, and like vice versa. So like can you tell us how that happened, and like how usually when you're writing the same poem in two different languages, how that plays out? And do you like do a literal translation of what you've written in one language to the other language, or do you um, like try to get yourself in the same mentality and have the same like emotion when you're writing the poem in a different language? So how does like that work?
Huh. That's an interesting question. So, I think bilingually in the sense that I don't translate when I'm thinking. So thoughts that occur to me in English, I speak in English. Then there are some thoughts that occur to me only in Hindi. Then I speak those in Hindi. When I was growing up, there was this strange rule in our household. I feel like after this interview, my parents are going to not like me very much. But
No, in fact, I
so
think your mom is going to get email saying that I also want to finish a book. Please, can you help me there?
yeah, so my mom is a Hindi teacher. Okay, so and my dad's Hindi is also really nice. The and my dad also writes poetry. He doesn't publish them at all because he writes for himself, but he's very good. Like one day I aspire to write verse as good as my father's.
Wow.
I know for sure I haven't gotten there yet, but so his Hindi and English are both fantastic, and my mom's Hindi is amazing, obviously, because she's a Hindi teacher. And so at home, when we were growing up, we had this rule where you're not allowed to mix languages in the same sentence. So if we were talking,
Hmm.
either it's English or it's Hindi, you're not allowed to mix. You can't say, "Acha, please कर दो इसे बहुत जल्दी है please like please is an English word, right? Then like
Hmm.
you can instead say say something in Hindi that's more appropriate, even if you can't think of the right word. And so growing up, our vocabulary, both for me and my brother, just expanded because we struggled a little bit in the beginning to find the right word.
Hmm.
But eventually, what it ended up doing was we both now are able to think in both languages quite coherently and without needing the other language. So thoughts generate in one or the other language, and sometimes poetry. So the way I write poems is um, the thought occurs to me, and then I just have to find myself a pen and paper and put it down before I forget it. And so generally it will come completely formed in a particular language. And a few years ago, like I think 4 5 years ago, it so started happening that I started thinking up poems that were bilingual. So the first two lines were in English, the next two lines were Hindi, then again English, and it was like a different mix. And it was an interesting format, and I decided to go with the flow and experiment. And so the first time I read a poem like that, it's a poem called Puff Puff Past Generation. It's in the third chapter of the book. And when I performed it, I got such good response. I couldn't believe it because everybody said that the transitions were really smooth. And so they never felt like I was switching in and out of two different languages. And I understand it's a little inaccessible to people who don't understand both English and Hindi. But for people who did understand both languages, the feedback was really nice. So then I decided doing that with a lot. I decided to do that with like a lot more pieces going forward. So a couple of the pieces in the book are bilingual. So for those, I haven't translated. But then when I was putting the book together, I realized English is a more accessible language for the kind of readers that I think the book will connect to, especially because people who, worked in a different city in a country. And so I decided that some poetry that I had written, which was completely in Hindi, I wanted to translate myself because I didn't want there to be a literal translation and then for the soul of the poem to sort of just be murdered in the process. I still remember there was this funny anecdote. I don't know if it's a joke or a WhatsApp forward or what, but this friend of mine was telling me where she said she was watching a movie that had been dubbed in Hindi, and it was a Hollywood movie. And so this person was in the way of some oncoming traffic or something, and this other guy tells him, "Oh, look out!" And you can make out from their face that he's saying, "Oh, look out!" But in the Hindi dubbed version, this guy is saying "Bahar dekho," which makes no sense. And yeah, and that has always stayed with me. So since that day, I have decided I will never trust translations of any artistic work because somewhere or the other, it loses its soul. So instead of literally translating the poems that I wrote in Hindi, I rewrote those poems in English to keep the essence the same and the meaning the same, even if it meant that it wasn't exactly what the Hindi poem was in terms of the content. So that's how I have translated the poems in the book. So people who understand English and Hindi both end up getting two poems, which are about the same theme but slightly different. So that's how I've gone about it. If you want, I can read one of the bilingual poems for you.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, the one you were talking about, Puff Puff Pass Generation, I think if you'd want to like read that, that'd be great. And also for our viewers, like Sushruti is also like she performs poetry also a lot, and like she's a very well-known performer. So like that's another reason like I really want to see her like read her poetry, because otherwise I think like lots of writers are not very comfortable reading out their work, or just like, okay, I've written, now somebody else has to read.
Yeah, no. So okay, so this is the book, Naan, Bread and Chai Latte, and so the third chapter is where Puff Puff Past Generation is. Oh, and before I perform it, so just a little bit of context to the poem that I haven't given in the book. So I mean, obviously, I didn't. The book has a lot of context, but it doesn't have all the context to all the poetry. So the title of this poem is actually a funny story. I have a friend, Tulika, and she was telling me about some anecdote from college, some college, outside college incident. And she mentioned the phrase puff, puff, pass, and I had no idea what it means. And so then I was eventually informed that, generally if people are smoking in a group, they take 2 drags of the cigarette and pass it along. So it's puff, puff, pass, and it basically goes around the group. And that was really fascinating to me because I don't smoke. And so it sounded like a very interesting way of sort of thinking about this, because the minute she explained that to me, she said, so, that's what people do. And I said, oh, but Tulika, this is such a good metaphor for what we do in life with like all sorts of things, our generation. And what I meant by that was that, today we're posting online about mental health and we're all, activists on social media about it. But 1 week later, the hashtag will become Black Lives Matter. And then the next week, the hashtag will become something else. There are so many things to care about. And I feel like me and the people around me, we move from one rebellion to another, in the way the cigarette moves from one person to the other in the group. So we spend some time with one rebellion before we move on to the next one. And so that's sort of the metaphor that led to me coining the term puff puff pass generation. And so that's what this poem is about. Okay, so here goes. Puff puff pass generation. We are a puff puff pass generation of puff puff pass rebellions. So take a drag on your cigarettes and smoke out your lungs, क्योंकि आग कोई दहक रही होगी अंदर जो इतना धुआं है. और अगर महज धुआं ही है बस, तो कभी माँ के मन में झांकना, तुम्हें वहां दिखेगा धुएं से आग कैसे सुलगती है. We are a puff puff pass generation of puff puff pass rebellions. So take another drag of depression and anxiety, slit your wrists, pass the blade, cut, pass, making doors on your skin for your soul to pass through. Quick escapes, slow deaths. अगर इतनी जल्दी है जाने की तो कोई असहनीय पीड़ा छोड़े जा रहे होगी. Unbearable pain, hurt pass, this undying pain unto those you love most. We are a puff puff pass generation of puff puff pass rebellions. Rebellions which are born of old monks and young blood mixing, making cocktails offered according to taste. You could order harmless fun or you could order violence. और मधुशाला, मधुहोशी सब शब्द कविताओं में कितने प्यारे लगते हैं. शुक्र है लेकिन उस लड़की को इन कविताओं को पढ़ना नहीं आता, वो लड़की जिसके पिताजी घर कल नशे में आए थे, जिसकी माँ ने अपने गम सिसकियों में डुबाए थे, जिसकी क्रांति भी मदिरा से जागेगी, मगर ऐसे कि we are such a generation of puff puff pass ironies, cronies, stealing time from our own lives, and I wish we could stop, but we puff puff pass our time. Killing time isn't murder but suicide. But what do we care about quotes? Quotes are but deadlines. We are a puff puff pass generation of puff puff pass rebellions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sushruti. This was very nice.
Yeah, I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, like before you started the poem, like one this cigarette thing I was imagining, but otherwise, like I was also thinking how it used to happen when you used to order food in the hostel late at night, that everyone would take one bite of the food and pass it forward.
That is a much better example of trying to explain that concept. Yes, I agree.
But no, that's like it immediately stuck in my mind the moment you gave me that cigarette example. But yeah, this was a very nice and a very hard-hitting poem. So thank you for that.
No, it's a pleasure to read it out. And, it always makes me revisit the process of writing it and performing it. In fact, this is my only poem that I get requests to perform. Like generally when I go up to perform, I'll perform whatever piece I have written for that evening or for that occasion. But if there's somebody in the audience that has seen me perform before, I will invariably end up getting a request to perform this piece. So it's a very special piece for me. So I'm glad I got to perform it.
Wow. Yeah, that's also like I'm sure that must feel very nice being recognized by like one poem which you've written, people asking you. It's like how after a song a musicians like they tell, oh, perform again. So I think
no, I mean I'm no rock concert musician, but it does feel nice. Yes. I mean I wouldn't deny it feels nice to know that people, recognize you for one of your works. It's always a nice feeling, and I'm always grateful for the love, because as an artist you also live a little bit for your audience. So a large part of my creation process is for myself and to process through emotions. But when I put the work out there, the idea is not to put out there my emotions or feelings, but to put out there a work that people can relate to, and hopefully something that helps them, either helps them realize they're not alone, or helps them find a sense of hope, or you know a semblance of something better, a silver lining. Like
Mm.
that's in fact the idea behind the whole book as well, which is that people who are chasing their dreams, or who are shifting to different continents, or struggling with identity, home, love, loss, they should be able to find something to relate to and realize that they're not alone in these journeys. So,
Yeah. So, yeah, like what you're talking about, like the relatability with the book, I also like agree with that completely. Because I think the first time we were also um, talking about the book, that's the time like I had read the book and I was saying that, oh, you talking about your work experience made me feel very similar to how like my work experience was. Um, like it was in India compared to like how yours was in England, but in terms of like living in a different city, working in a working at a law firm, like all those things were very similar. Um, so yeah, so I'm sure like all these experiences you've talked about, like people who are going through these experiences or like who just want to read and relate to these experiences, like find your book, like like take some solace in your book. I think that'd be great. So this
yeah.
brings me to the last question that so now I think the first book you've published, which is like the hardest milestone I think to crack, like how they say the first million is the most difficult and everything after that is the easiest. So I think like with books also, like how like I feel personally the first book is the most difficult. After that, like you have different problems, but like that first book hurdle isn't there. So, so now that the first book is out there, what is your like? Do you have a plan for like the next book, or if not the next book, then like what are you looking forward to now with this book?
In my head, I was like, I should redirect this question to my mom, but no. Yeah.
Yeah, if
I
she's
mean,
nearby, you can ask her to come and answer.
I'm sure she'd be happy to, but I will not trouble her right now. Yeah, no, I think I would. y- Mothers, especially Indian mothers, have this thing where they, once you do something that they've been asking you to do for a very long time, then once it's done, then they don't care about it. Then they're on to the next. So my mom has asked me the same question. And she's like, "Acha, abhi next book come." So, and so I thought about it in a little bit of detail, and I realized you're right about the first book hurdle sort of being a major thing to break out of. And in that sense, I am a lot more confident about my writing now than I was before publishing the book, because I've gotten good feedback. Some of the reviews on Amazon made my day. And like just generally, the feedback has been so positive about how people felt when they read it. And both from people who know me, so her friends, and also from a couple of people who don't know me but heard about the book and then found me on Instagram and said, "Oh, by the way, I read your book and this part I related to quite a bit, and thank you for writing it." And those are the sort of things that make you realize, okay, you're a decent writer. You're not probably as bad as your self-critical things uh, you know make you out to be. And so then I realized I would definitely want to publish another poetry book, and hopefully short stories, and eventually a novel, like in terms of the fiction side of things. But I'm also now intrigued to write a book that mixes my passion for art and law. So that is something I would definitely want to explore. So in terms of, for example, the histories of different populations, and the cultures of different populations, and how that interacts with, say, sustainable practices and environmental practices, because that's the area of law that I'm interested in, and see how art and sustainability and art and environment have grown together in different cultures and in different geographies. And those are areas I would really like to research and look up, and if possible, do field studies in. So if that's sort of a project that I would really like to work on, and I have some ideas to what I want to do. And I think it will be in the area of climate change, and a little bit of fiction and story writing, but also scientific and legal in its outlook. So that's sort of the book that I'm hoping eventually I will end up writing. I don't know when or how, but it's an idea that I have that I would really like to nurture. And so, yeah, I mean, hopefully there'll be more books, and ideally with traditional publishers, because now I've already seen the self-publishing route. So I want to see what it is like to publish with a publisher that takes care of the process and the marketing and other things, and you just basically have to present them with the manuscript and your job is done. So it would be interesting to see that process. So yes, fingers crossed, and hopefully another book does come about to be soon. Let's see.
Wow, yeah,
I'm hopeful.
that sounds very interesting, and we'll also be like looking out for this so that like you can come and have a conversation about your second book, and that will be really nice to like see the perspective and like how that book turns out. Um,
Oh yeah, I look forward to that. Amen to that.
yeah, so thank you so much, Sushri. It was really nice talking to you. I got to learn a lot about like I also have like now a few books to add to my TBR list. So thank you for that. I got to learn a lot about like poetry, about how that interacts with law, conflict resolution. And I got to know the author side of the story because I think that's always very interesting because I was reading a book and then to get to talk to the author about like how they felt, what they went through, and how this book happened. It's like really nice. So thank you for that. We had a great time talking to you. To our viewers also, please check out Shushruti's book. I'll link it in the description. I'll also link her Instagram ID and her LinkedIn profile if you want to talk to her about like poetry, about writing, about like any of these areas which she's talked about. Please do hit her up. It will be really nice for you to connect. And we hope you have a good day, Shushruti.
Thank you so much, Umang, for having me. This conversation was lovely. And yes, like Umang said, I'm always happy to talk to people and have more conversations. So do hit me up. Thanks so much for a lovely time. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you, Umang.
Thank you, Shushi. The pleasure was all ours.